Okay, so we're here with Tizza at a sushi restaurant in Vancouver, BC on Main Street. Tizza, it was extraordinary to meet you through quite a fluke chance the other night when you popped into a show of First Nations musicians here in the city. First up, would you like to describe your background with Vancouver? We were just talking off air about Vancouver. Right. How did you come to be here?
Gosh, well, I guess I did what most people do, or most people did back in the late 80s, which was go to London and go travelling around Europe, backpacking around. And I kept meeting, you're meeting folks from all around the world when you're travelling. I kept meeting people from Canada and just sort of having this great affinity and friendship, forming these great friendships. And 2 or 3 different people gave me their addresses here and said, if you're ever in Vancouver, come and stay. So I moved to California from London and bought a 72 Volkswagen Combi, and my sister and I drove the coast all the way up Pacific Coast Highway up here to Vancouver, and got here and met up with these people who had given me their addresses, and just everything opened up. It was just gold, just wonderful, friendly people, very giving. Here's my car, here's my boat. Come and stay in my house. It was a great place to come to, and that's where it all started.
Wow. And can you describe much of your memories of that time? I know it wasn't a musical time for you, but did you see any music when you were here, or in the 80s in Vancouver, or?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it was pretty jumping back in those days here. I guess the Seattle sound thing was taking off, like Nirvana and the Screaming Trees and bands like that were all taking off around there. That it was a very fervent era. There was some great places here down in Gastown. There was a place called the Town Pump, which was a very famous joint, and all sorts of amazing bands would play there. In fact, I saw the Painters and Dockers from Melbourne play there back in those days, which was pretty. It was actually a very drunken, crazy affair. They were a pretty crazy band. So lots of the. It was interesting. You keep your eyes out, obviously, when I was living here for the Aussie bands coming over, and then drag all your Vancouver friends down there, and you've got to see these guys. They're from home, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So it was great, and of course the Commodore Ballroom, which is still a functioning gig, was a great place to go to as well. And then the bigger bands at the Orpheum, Crowded House at the Orpheum, and then of course all the wonderful Canadian acts as well. The Tragically Hip, when they would come across and play, and the Bare Naked Ladies, Katie Lang and the Reclines. There was all sorts of fantastic stuff going on in that day.
And then you returned to Sydney. Musically, what can you tell us about yourself? So you are a drummer?
Yep. These days I'm playing drums more than anything. I played in bands when I was younger, playing rhythm guitar and singing, lead vocals. But these days, I'm actually playing in a very fun ukulele band at the moment, which is the Freshwater Ukulele Recital Society, which, if you shorten that, becomes the Fukas. We're having a grand old time. And I'm actually, one of the favourite things in that, I play washboard, which has been one of my lifelong dreams, to play the washboard ever since going to New Orleans and seeing this old black guy there one day, playing the washboard. And, yeah.
How about the lagerphone? Is that?
No, we don't really have a lagerphone. It's a bit more Aussie bush band, I think.
Yeah. So you lived here for a few years in that period, went back to Sydney and dived back into music.
Yeah, I did. I ended up. I got approached by a friend of mine to put a band together for a 30th birthday party, which we did, and then that sort of got me back into playing, and then that led me on to touring again. A young band called Raw Sugar that some friends of mine were signed at that point to Festival Records, and so we started touring with those guys around the east coast of Australia, and it kind of got me back into the management side of things, where I met up with a guy called Buzz Bidstrup, who was drummer in the Angels and Gangajang, and he had recently got the gig to manage Jimmy Little, and so I became involved working with Jimmy Little back in those days, helping out with a bit of tour management stuff, and then also doing some building work for him at his house to build a home studio. And what it did lead to, however, was unfortunately Jimmy had renal failure. His kidneys went, which is a really big deal amongst the Aboriginal people at home, as it is with the Aboriginal people here in Canada as well. In Australia, it's something like 30 times more prevalent in Indigenous people than it is in European people. And so, yeah, his kidneys went, and through that process, that really limited and restricted his ability to go on the road and tour. So he put together a foundation to try and educate young Aboriginal people, and also just do whatever we could do to try and prevent this illness happening.
And so Jimmy, I've actually seen stuff on YouTube of him. Yeah, he was quite articulate and vocal around Aboriginal health issues.
Absolutely.
Do you have any? Can you fill us in about what it was like to know him as a person? Any insights into the man himself?
Absolutely. I guess firstly by saying that my life was so blessed by coming into his life. He was a very middle of the road kind of guy. He was never one for sort of raising his fist and protesting and carrying on about things. He just got about his life. He always talked about being an Australian. He was a proud Aboriginal man, but he was an Australian, and he was very much for equality in that respect, by going down the middle of the road, not by stomping his foot and not by carrying on about things. He just did things in a very natural way. Just coming back to my family and my upbringing, we're all sort of working class from Glebe in Sydney. I had a lot of aunts and uncles. Once I did meet Jimmy and his family, and the extended family, I found all these similarities between my Christmases as a small child with the big extended family, and now with this Aboriginal family. There was a lot of things there that were very similar. I felt very comfortable in it. I was always made to feel very welcomed and trusted, which was a wonderful thing. I guess growing up in Sydney too, in the general populace, we really had no education about Aboriginal people or Aboriginal ways. So for me, it was a crash course in Aboriginal education, I suppose, and something of which I would never claim to be an expert on. I know very little about it, and every day I hopefully learn a bit more about it.
Okay, there's a track there from Jimmy Little called Baby Blue. Jimmy Little is a very well-regarded Australian Aboriginal singer-songwriter, performer, who passed away recently, and we're speaking with Tizza, who is an Australian who worked closely with Jimmy Little. Let's get back into part 2 of the interview.
And have you travelled much in Australia to other Aboriginal communities outside of Sydney, or?
Yes. Yeah, we did. We put together a thing called Uncle Jimmy Thumbs Up, and we would go out to basically Thumbs Up for Healthy Tucker was the whole idea of it, and we would go out to remote Aboriginal communities and do healthy food workshops, and we'd go out there with Aboriginal musicians. Shelley Morris was the good friend of mine now, and great gal to work with, amazing with the children. And we'd write songs with the kids about healthy food, healthy lifestyle, eating whatever food was from that area, trying to get away from eating, processed foods, white flour, white sugar, all the stuff that sort of leads to that renal failure. We'd encourage the kids to write stuff in their language, to give them more sort of power. And then we would record it, put it together, write a video, shoot the video, cut it all up, squash it all, put it into Bluetoothable format and give them to them so that the kids could bounce it around on their telephones, and also upload it to YouTube and stuff like that, just to kind of keep the kids interested in it, and then they could sing the song to each other, and just something else to keep that awareness about the healthy food and healthy lifestyles, but also to empower those kids to then go, hey, I learned how to do this, and then give them the skills and technique to do it themselves.
Yeah, it wasn't just preaching a message that can go over the head.
Absolutely, and that was very Jimmy. That was what he was all about. It was all about, what's the saying? Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach him how to fish, he'll eat forever. And that was very much what all that stuff was about.
We were talking offline before about prominent people that not all of them have to become a tabloid kind of figure, and he's
Right.
as you say, he's someone who lived a balanced life, and he just presented himself as composed and was clearly a good role model. That comes across.
Absolutely. I mean, here's the interesting thing is that, you know, blackfella politic, and I don't know how this goes here in Canada, I assume it's kind of similar, but blackfella politic is very strong in Australia, you know, and there's so many nations within our nation of different peoples, and there's a lot of prejudice and there's a lot of stuff going on between, you know, Aboriginal to Aboriginal. For instance, you know, say a famous, you know, Aboriginal person at home in the media, say it's like Ernie Dingo, right? You know, someone, so he's from the West, and someone from over here would go, I don't trust him. You know, another Aboriginal fellow. Why? Because he's from over that mob. You know, like weird. Yeah, and you go, really? But you're all the same mob. No, we're not the same mob. We're all different mobs, right? But Jimmy had this amazing ability to cut through the middle of all of that stuff. And when I went out there as his representative, I'd obviously have, you know, Jimmy Little Foundation stickers on me, so, you know, so Aboriginal folks would see that. And it was a golden passport. I was pretty much allowed to go into anywhere. It just gave me permission. I would still, of course, be respectful and ask permission before I went on to tribal lands, but it was, for me, I would have to pinch myself sometimes and go, I'm just a little white fella from Sydney, how is it possible that I'm granted access to all this stuff, you know? It was incredible.
Yeah. Oh, it's such an amazing experience, and this was up to kind of the recent past, because he only passed away last year. Were you working closely with him?
Last year. I was very lucky once again. He moved back up to Dubbo in central New South Wales, probably a 5 or 6 hour drive from Sydney. And just to fill you on another thing, I rode a motorcycle solo around Australia as an awareness and fundraiser for the foundation back in 2007. So I went up to see him, and I didn't, of course, realise at the time he was going to pass, but I rode up there on the motorcycle. I was selling the bike, and so I thought, well, for its last run, I'm going to go up and see Uncle Jim, you know. Whoa. So I went up there and spent a beautiful weekend with him, and that was about a month before he passed, and then he and his daughter were down in Sydney 2 weeks after that, and my mum and I went out with those guys, and we went to the theatre and saw a show together. But he was kind of happy, you know. He was in a good space. It was actually a bit of a surprise that he did go, because he was actually looking pretty good, you know, and getting ready to do the next thing, you know, move on to the next thing. He was talking about doing another album and getting on. So, but he was very lucky in that he went in his sleep. Wouldn't that be nice?
That's right, yeah. and leaves a wonderful legacy. Are there any songs in particular that you would recommend, or, you know, I mean, he was around for such a long time, and myself, I'm not overly familiar with his catalogue.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it goes way back. You know, he came up to Sydney when he was 18 years old, I think, or 17 or 18 years old, and with the desire to record songs and be a star. A lot of his early stuff was kind of like crooning, you know, like country crooning. He was a balladeer. He's a very velvet voice, beautiful voice, absolutely beautiful voice, and a great one of those great old school craftsmen of music. You know, he would take a song and he would really make it his own. You know, he had a big hit called "The Royal Telephone" in Australia, which was, I believe, it was an American penned song that was the record company got him to do, I think, and that, I guess, was his most famous. And then a wonderful guy called Brendan Gallagher, who was in a band called Karma County, went to see Jim at the Balmain RSL Club, the Return Services League Club at the Legion Hall here in Canada. And there was Jim, you know, performing this thing, and Brendan was just blown away, you know, and Brendan was a record producer as well as an artist and singer-songwriter. And he went and approached him and introduced himself, and he said, I've got an idea, you know, can we record this album? Would you like to work with me? And Jim, of course, said, yeah, that'd be great. And that album became Messenger, which was in 1999, and that then took off to the top of the charts. Songs by The Church, we were talking about before, and Neil Finn and Paul Kelly, and a wonderful, wonderful album with wonderful, great interpretations of songs on it. Therefore, opening up this old man into a whole new young clientele, which is fantastic.
It's kind of a little bit like the Johnny Cash phenomenon, like that last couple of albums.
With the 9 Inch Nails and all that.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, because that's it. I knew about Jimmy Little through that album that was played on Triple J Radio.
That's right.
The Youth Network.
The Youth Network. Yeah, that's right.
I wonder if you could comment, going back to Vancouver, and we were talking before about comparisons with, like the struggles now around ownership of property that leads to venues disappearing and things like that, and the struggles with live
the music.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's a really interesting thing too, and the closing up of so many music venues, But I was in Seattle last week. This is interesting. So I was in Seattle last week, and the music thing is really alive and kicking. Now, I mean, the States is kind of where litigation sort of all came from, and where, at the moment, I feel in Australia and in Canada as well, that we're kind of ruled by the insurance companies, I guess, and the lawyers saying, we won't give you public liability insurance unless you do X, Y, and Z. Now, that might mean that if you had a 1,000-person venue before, they'll say, well, if there's a fire, then we could get sued, so we're going to close that down. And that happens time and time and time again. Kind of interesting, the States is still sort of forging ahead and having these so-called dangerous venues, which aren't. They're fantastic. They're healthy, and they've got healthy musicians. It's a great place for all this to happen. It is interesting that it's been squashed in places like Vancouver and Sydney as well. I think back to when I was a young guy playing music, there must have been something like, I don't know, 120 venues between, say, the city and Palm Beach, which was a 40-kilometre stretch where I lived, and now there's about 3.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. So they've either been. I mean, there's bunches of reasons why they've been swallowed up, but it's kind of the downfall of us, I think, because it's getting away from community. The wonderful thing about most Indigenous communities that I've visited is that community is everything.
Yeah.
It's all about family, it's all about community, it's all about keeping it together within each other and supporting each other.
Absolutely, and I mean, we're seeing here things reaching breaking point. I think it's going to be a return to community somehow, because what's working isn't working.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I'm curious just to see what happens.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how much longer we can sustain the way that we're going, but I don't know. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll find out ways of getting around it and, join in.
And we're always going to need music. Music will not die, and everything's fragmented so much these days. But we still need people to play music live. That basic human need will never disappear. So it happens here in this city, behind closed doors and in living rooms now and things like that.
That's right. Well, yeah, I guess it's moving to YouTube, but it's still, music and entertainment, theatre, it's always been, that's the voice of change. If you go back to the days of, Shakespearean days, that's how social issues and whatnot got dealt with, brought up with in conversation, and then somehow changed, and music has always been like that. Rock and roll has always been a bit rebellious. I mean, you look back at the early days of, say, Midnight Oil, Beds Are Burning, like great stuff that gets people, maybe even redneck folk, to think maybe there is a bit more. Maybe I should open my mind up a little bit and see what that's all about. I suppose it'll morph and move along. I just hope there's a little bit more chances for Indigenous music to move back into the mainstream and helping the rest of us, make better decisions and creating a better world
and inform policy. And I think technology is the best chance we've had yet of use the best part of the modern world to bring back the best of the old world in a way.
Well, here's an interesting thing. When we travel out there to remote Aboriginal community, one of our things was to get these videos that we made, squashed down into Bluetoothable, because all the kids have got phones. They've embraced that side of the technology, which is interesting. And a lot of these people are still hunting. They're still making spears and hunting.
Wow.
So it's kind of just reminded me of, I was in Sri Lanka last year travelling, and I met a wonderful Buddhist monk, and and he had nothing on him except his robes and, of course, his mobile phone. You know, and there it is.
Yeah.
And on that point, you know, with the Facebook thing, you know, I'm sort of reluctantly on Facebook, you know, these days, like we all are. But I've noticed that the most prevalent users of Facebook amongst all my friends are actually my Aboriginal friends.
Wow.
They're on it all the time. They've really embraced that technology, and I guess to them it's a message stick. You know, it's a way of getting on. There's a funny Aboriginal folk at home, as I'm sure they are here, have a great sense of humour. And when the mobile phones came out, they got called, or got nicknamed the Telling Bone.
That's classic.
Yeah. And so yeah, with that Facebook thing, it's you know, it's quite amazing.
That ancestral bird, while go out, black as the night, go out, cried through the lonely sky, lonely sky.